All right, welcome back to day two, part two of our notes, and we're going to be talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, all right? And then a little bit of the easing of Cold War tension that happens post-missile crisis, because it actually gets us to the point, the Cuban Missile Crisis, where people are like, man, this almost got a little too intense. It almost got too real, all right? And I will tell you, when we're talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis, think back to that early Cold War unit that we did. And we talked about like MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction, and some of those doctrines, because that's what the Cuban Missile Crisis is. It's an early part that, the late 40s, early 50s are just continuing into the 1960s, all right? So, the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days on the brink of nuclear war. So pretty much for 2 weeks, there was this constant threat in the United States that nuclear war was pretty much imminent, that it was going to happen no matter what, okay? Well, how does that come to fruition? How did that happen? In October 1962, a U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba, another U-2 spy plane, all right? So obviously, even though Francis Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union, we're going to continue to use these U-2 planes to continually spy on communism. The U-2 spy plane discovered the Soviet Union was building missile launching sites on the island. Well, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out what are they going to launch those missiles to. Obviously, the United States, right? This is in direct response to our missile sites in Turkey. They are saying, whoa, wait a second. You have missile sites and you have missiles pointed at arming parts of the country in Moscow, Kiev, St. Petersburg, things like that. So why can't we have missile launch sites in Cuba pointed at Washington, D.C., New York City, and places like that? Missiles carrying nuclear warheads could easily reach most major cities in the United States from Cuba, because it's only 90 miles away. So it can stretch pretty much, the only place it couldn't go to is like Seattle, Washington. Like Washington, the state, a little bit of Oregon and like Idaho is pretty much the furthest away that it can reach. It could reach California, it could reach Texas, it could reach Ohio, the Dakotas, all the way up to Maine and Vermont. So obviously Florida can definitely reach. So pretty much all of the United States could easily be destroyed if there were enough nuclear warheads put in Cuba. So this is extremely stressful for everyone in the United States. It's not like it's only an East Coast problem, a West Coast problem, or a Southern problem. It's a problem for everyone. No matter where you live, you could be within this missile launch zone, all right? Some advisors urged the president to bomb the missile sites before they could be completed or operational. The only problem with that is then you're attacking the Soviet Union. You've now taken the Cold War from being cold to a hot war. Well, do you want to be the president that starts a war with the Soviet Union that would last years and have millions of deaths? Probably not. So that's an option that Kennedy's like, yeah, I'm probably not going to do that because I don't think that's what's actually best for our country. Others suggested blockading Cuban ports to prevent Soviet ships from bringing the missiles to the island. That's probably the better option here because you can go out in international water, you can blockade, all right, and all you're doing is stopping. Now, if they want to start an aggressive front and start attacking the ships, then that's their problem. That's not the American problem. You could retaliate then, and it's not your fault. You didn't start the war. They would start the war, okay? But the term blockade is actually seen as an act of war, all right? So you have to be very careful. You can't completely stop their ships, but you can at least show a presence and show that you're acknowledging of what they're doing, okay? They called the blockade a quarantine, which is kind of ironic because we're in a quarantine right now, all right? So we're quarantining Cuba. We're just not allowing anything to come in or leave, all right? Because again, remember, a blockade is an act of war. A quarantine is not, all right? Because under international law, establishing a naval blockade is an act of war. So Kennedy decides to go with this quarantine of Cuba, all right? So Khrushchev sent a note to Kennedy agreeing to remove Soviet missiles from Cuba. It's amazing. Like, we're still back in the day, they're like sending notes and sending telegrams back and forth. And eventually they're going to have a phone hotline that's going to connect them. So Kennedy gets this message saying, okay, the Soviets understand that tensions are starting to escalate. What can we do to help ease this? We're like, well, one thing we can do is we'll remove our missile launch sites. If they're not going to do this just out of the kindness of their hearts, He demanded that Kennedy end the Cuban blockade and promised to not invade Cuba, obviously in response to the Bay of Pigs invasion. So he's like, allow Cuba to remain communist. End your blockade, allow us to get goods in, allow us to help Castro reemerge as a leader and show how strong he is, and allow communism to thrive in their country. He sent a second note, and in this second note, Khrushchev promised removing the Cuban missiles in exchange for the United States removing missiles it had placed in Turkey, because he realized we weren't going to stop our blockade or our quarantine on Cuba. We're not going to invade them because we don't want to start a war, but we're still blockading, we're still quarantining the country. Kennedy accepts the agreement in the second note of us removing our missiles from Turkey. And you're probably sitting there going, well, that doesn't make sense. Now we've lost our strategic advantage. Well, if we remove our missiles and they remove their missiles, now there's no way you can attack either country's home country. All right? We can't attack the Soviet Union from Turkey. They can't attack us from Cuba. So it actually helps de-escalate the situation. Plus, Kennedy had already decided, he hadn't made it public knowledge yet, that he was going to remove the missiles from Turkey anyways. Why is that? All right? Because they were outdated. They were put in the 1940s. We have new technology and better technology that can reach from ships, from destroyers in the Mediterranean. So we don't need missiles in Turkey anymore. And so we agree to the second note. Khrushchev and Kennedy come together, and it looks like, oh my gosh, they're doing something that's peaceful. They're helping each other out. There's no longer going to be war. When in fact, yes, the Soviets are removing their missiles, so it's de-escalating the threat here in the United States of nuclear war. But Kennedy's like, yeah, we're removing our missiles from Turkey. Don't worry, we still have missiles in the Mediterranean that can reach your country. All right? So we still do have an upper hand advantage in this situation. Publicly, Kennedy accepted the first deal. Privately, he sent Robert Kennedy to the Soviet embassy to agree to the second deal. So we're going to come out and we're going to say, hey, we're going to stop the blockade. We're going to do all this. But we're also behind America's back. We are going to go in and we are going to remove everything without making it public knowledge. All right? Now, again, he had his motivating factors on why he was removing these missiles from Turkey. All right? Now, some may say, well, Mr. Montgomery, we didn't trade and we had embargoes placed on Cuba. And we did until up in about 4 years ago. That is the case. So we're going to end the blockade and we're now going to put embargoes on the country, which means you can't buy or sell or trade with Cuba. It's pretty much the same thing as a blockade, right? We're just telling American companies, any other countries, that they can't trade with them. And so effectively it is blockading them without actually having naval ships out in the port. Khrushchev agreed to remove all Soviet missiles from Cuba. 3 months later, the missiles in Turkey were gone. So look at that de-escalation. We went from day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of being like nuclear war is going to happen, ducking cover, we have to work on it, mad, mutually assured destruction, to the last 3 days, day 11, 12, 13, the communication between Khrushchev and Kennedy intensifies, and they're able to use, when we talk about foreign policy, part 1, negotiating, right? They're able to talk to one another, diplomacy, and de-escalate the situation, right? It went to step 2. I had to take a little bribery of us taking away our missiles, them taking away their missiles, but that's usually the case. At least it didn't go to step 3 of foreign policy, which is war. So the last slide we're going to do today, easing the Cold War tensions. The Cuban Missile Crisis led Kennedy and his advisors to rethink the doctrine of massive retaliation, all right? You know, is this a good idea if they bomb us to bomb them? Is it a good idea to use MAD, mutually assured destruction? If they use a nuke, we use a nuke, then everyone keeps nuking each other, and then all countries are completely destroyed. Kennedy began to talk about the need for a flexible response to local Cold War conflicts. He tried this in Vietnam by sending money and military advisors to Vietnam to build non-communist forces in the country. So what are ways that we can help stop the spread of communism without being directly involved? So without sending American warships, American troops, American missiles. how can we covertly go around in these countries and stop communism? Well, we can use our influence of money, all right? We can help finance or help pay for rebellions or rebel fighters. Because of the Cuban Missile Crisis, both countries began looking for ways to ease tensions between the superpowers. So how can we maybe not get ourselves that close to actually destroying each other? Because we realized the threat was pretty real in 1962. The two leaders established a hotline between the two countries, so if something like this ever happens again, they can pick up a phone, they have a direct line to Moscow from Washington, D.C., and they can talk about it. So nothing no one's going to press the button and launch a nuke without them discussing this first. That hotline is always open. The hotline still exists today and has been tested once an hour since 1963. So there's someone's job in the government. Once an hour, they make a phone call to Moscow, make sure the phone connection's still good, make sure we're still talking, and then they hang up. And that's because we are two superpowers and two countries that are very powerful with very large militaries, and sometimes we don't get along with one another. And so we want to make sure we have that direct line of communication between our leaders in case something would happen, and make sure it doesn't escalate to the point of a conflict between our two countries. Along with Great Britain, the United States signed a test ban treaty. This agreement banned nuclear testing in the atmosphere, and what it did was we actually moved our testing of nuclear weapons underground. So you have to test it underground or in water, all right, so that you don't get the fallout effects in the atmosphere, all right? So for today, you guys need to, after watching these video lectures, you have a primary source activity on the Cuban Missile Crisis that you guys will be working on. So make sure you work on that. Get that into me on Tuesday, all right? Continue to work on your reading questions and vocab. I hope you guys have a great day. Come back tomorrow for our next video lecture, all right? And then you guys have a quiz on Wednesday and a quick write. Thursday we'll have another video lecture, and then you guys will have quiz part 2 on Friday, and then another quick write, all right? Let's have a great week. Let's keep after it. If you have any questions, make sure you post them on the discussion board. Make sure you're emailing me, and make sure we're ready to go because next week we will test on this. All right? If you have anything missing, make sure you're getting it done. Okay? Have a great day. I'll see you guys tomorrow for our video lecture. Have a great Monday. Go Pacers.